Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2020, the Russian armed forces were generally portrayed as a capable and competent force by many analysts. To quote the US Defense Intelligence Agency publication about military power of Russia from 2017, the Russian military today is on the rise, not as the same Soviet force that faced the West in the Cold War, dependent on large units with heavy equipment, but as a smaller, more mobile, balanced force rapidly becoming capable of conducting the full range of modern warfare. It is a military that can intervene in countries along Russia's periphery or as far away as the Middle East. The new Russian military is a tool that can be used to underpin Moscow's stated ambitions of being a leading force in a multipolar world. Similarly, Michael Kaufman, who is currently director at the Russia Studies at the Center for Naval Analysis, wrote in February 2017, so about 5 years before the invasion, the following. The Russian military that the United States faces in 2017 is not the poorly equipped and uncoordinated force that invaded Georgia in August of 2008. This is why the magnitude and potential impact of the current crisis is far greater than that inherited by the Obama administration in 2009. Following reforms launched in October 2008 and a modernization program in 2011 valued at $670 billion, the armed forces have become one of Russia's most reliable instruments of national power. Russia disbanded the useless mass mobilization army of the Soviet Union, consolidated what was worthwhile and reconstituted a much smaller but more capable force. The overall size of Russia's armed forces continues to increase, numbering over 900,000 today, while the state armament program continues to replace aging equipment throughout the force with new or modernized variants. Although in the same article he pointed out that the Russian armed forces would not be a threat to Ukraine. Practical constraints tell us that Russia's military is not an existential threat to Europe or even Ukraine for that matter, but that it can impose its will by force on neighboring countries and that Moscow is credible when it threatens to do so. Hence, Russia's military is a powerful tool for coercion. More recently, in January 2022, Rob Lee, a senior fellow at Foreign Policy Research Institute Eurasia program, stated in an article, Russia is in a strong position to force the issue now. The Russians' military's southern and western military districts, which share a border with Ukraine, have completed the previous two annual Strategic Command Staff exercises, Kafkats 2020 and Zapad 2021, that rotate every year and focus on fighting in high-intensity conventional conflict. The rearmament of the Black Sea Fleet since 2014 has largely been completed with the commissioning of more than a dozen diesel submarines and surface ships capable of carrying caliber cruise missiles. And the Russian ground forces have been re-equipped with 12 Iskander-M brigades since 2010. The Russian military continues to rearm and will remain more powerful than Ukraine's in absolute terms. Still, its relative size vis-à-vis Ukraine will likely decline over time, given Ukraine's current modernization efforts incentivizing a Russian military operation now. Additionally, Russia has girded itself for confrontation. Its economy is in a far stronger position today. International reserves are currently at an all-time high. Then, when Moscow invaded Ukraine and intervened in Syria in 2014-2015 during a severe economic downturn. Moscow's crackdown on domestic opposition has also reduced the threat of serious protests. Probably one of the most extreme positions directly after the invasion of Ukraine came from the former German General Kuyat, that stated that the Ukrainian army has no chance. Kuyat was from 2000 to 2002 Inspector General of the Bundeswehr, which is the highest ranking military position in the Bundeswehr. On the question what chances the Ukrainian army has, Kuyat responded keine or none in English, particularly stating that this is not a war of the 20th century but the 21st century. He further states what is summarized as follows. There's a massive deployment of modern weapon systems intended to destroy defensive capability of the Ukrainian army. Only then would the conventional Russian land forces advance. And overall, the errors went not unnoticed. CNN reported on the 15th May 2022, the US intelligence community is carrying out a sweeping internal review of how it assesses the fighting power of foreign militaries amid mounting pressure from key lawmakers on Capitol Hill, who say officials had failed twice in 1 year on two major foreign policy crises faced by the Biden administration in Ukraine and Afghanistan. Now be aware, errors and misjudgments happen all the time. I made my fair share as well. The focus of this video is not why some people got it wrong, but why, or better how, the guest got it right. Because from my understanding, he works differently than various other analysts, and I think there's a lesson we can learn from, in general and also historians, since in the end it comes down to the interpretation of sources. Additionally, it is important to point out that Estonian diplomats and officers had very good assessments according to Stan, something he forgot to mention during the interview. Today I will talk to Stanimir Dobrev, who is a Bulgarian pro bono analyst that wrote several articles years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine that pointed out that the Russian armed forces might have serious issues. Of particular importance are these two articles called Dwarfing the Giant, the reality of Russia's military from 2018. Hello Stan, thank you for joining us.
Hi.
From my understanding, you were not particularly surprised about the performance of the Russian armed forces during the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So why were you not surprised?
Well, it was actually several things. For starters, a lot of the training that was getting a lot of attention actually was mostly pro forma training or training to get some material to be shot for Zvezda, and that propagates as a way to boost the prestige of the Russian armed forces. If you look down to the unit training and just basic readiness things that they had to do, the situation was vastly different. They also didn't actually have the troop numbers, so they had to scrounge up a lot of troops. But if you had followed, let's say, Russian bloggers like Denis Makrushin for a while, what he was posting, what also the Russian military prosecution was posting in terms of all the corruption they were finding, in terms of sort of fake soldiers, fake contracts, people getting paid so that they would change the qualification of certain troops. That's why they would get extra benefits. In Russian, that would be nadbavki. Sorry for the Bulgarian pronunciation there, but there were a lot of reasons to believe that the numbers that were being announced as numbers of troops, especially within the ground forces, were highly inflated. The troops weren't training as much. And if you started looking at testimonials of actual conscripts who served within the forces, they were saying things like, there's no way 50% of the force is professional. Here, most of the low ranks are not professional soldiers. And we also don't get uniforms and unit markings and unit training until past the 6-month mark. So it felt like all the lower echelons were not honest with the upper command about what the force was. They kept finding out even greater corruption that had to be suppressed from time to time. And the valve that would have been the release valve for all that corruption and to release it to the public and then have anyone or someone within the government to do something was sort of silenced. We had sequential banning of bloggers reporting on things. We had criminal prosecution of even established military journalists, like the case with Kommersant's journalists. And they classified all the reports on actual soldiers in terms of soldier numbers, and you just got official press releases. And if you started to look at some of the things that they were saying actually in their own internal reviews or what they were hyping up, they were saying things like, finally, our pilots in the southern districts are making 70, 80 hours of flight time per year, which is not sufficient for actual military pilots in case of fighter pilots to actually train with everything, especially when they were usually doing long patrols to intercept or to probe NATO aircraft, or they were patrolling to Syria. They were saying things like, bomber pilots have finally reached 120 hours. And here we're talking about long range aviation. And again, that's nowhere near enough. They were saying that we've solved the issue with pilot training. So now we have huge classes of 600 people. And then you look at the situation that they went from within 4 years from 25 people being trained in the Ulyanovsk flight school to 600 people while still having around 300 planes with 50% to 60% availability. So what it meant that they didn't fix the issues, they just drastically ramped up so on paper it would look fixed. And there were a lot of things that, if you look at them, it seemed like they were fixing things pro forma, while otherwise the existing issues persisted, and the Russian military seemed getting weaker and weaker because pay had to be increased, overseas deployments were increased, but the pay raises never actually matched what the actual cost of living was, and the budget remained the same. We had a lot of cases of brigades being bumped up to divisions without noticing enough people to go in. You even had the case where in the East, they were forming units which didn't have enough equipment. So, for example, there are several units which should have a battalion of tanks, but only have a company. Yes, for instance, the naval infantry divisions have 10 tanks within them. Infantry, not divisions, but brigades. They have 10 tanks within them.
They should have had, basically.
Yes, they should have had more vehicles, but let's say one of them got 40 BMP-3s, but the rest of them usually had 60 BTR variants. So that's all the organic armored APCs for the brigade. And there are so many things like that that kept layering and layering. And on top of that, if you add costs within Syria, which were usually handled through the operations budget of the army, that meant that the operations budget for actual training, for sustainment things, was being eaten away. And the other thing is that they never really fixed the problem with military housing, which is a big issue if you have an incentive via housing and Russian federal loans to get a lower mortgage rate for privates within the infantry and lower ranks within the infantry, for them to stay a long time and not just quit during the initial few months of grace period for a contract. And then the other option is what happens to a lot of them is they don't re-enlist after the 3 years of their contract service. So it didn't seem like they had actually the equipment situation. It seemed that some units away from the spotlights in the East were even weaker than people assumed. It didn't seem that the manpower was there to do all these things. And the entire final preparation for the invasion seemed to be driven by assumptions from the civilian political leadership, which, because it is much higher in the pecking order in Russia, so even though people are looking at the military as something that's being hyped up and strong, within the Russian government, it's below a lot of other ministries, below a lot of other state corporations in terms of priority. So it was not unreasonable to think that the military senior officials would hide or would try not to voice their concerns, or even if they voice their concerns, they would be overruled because the civilian side of things has a lot more control than in other places. And even it has the ability to basically disregard things, because in other sectors, it doesn't usually damage them if they disregard things from experts in the field. And on the eve of the entire invasion, it seemed like all of these things were combining to finally get a clash between the imagined Russian army and the reality of what's happening. And that even though it seems Ukraine wasn't fully aware that they could do something this stupid, that the Ukrainian army was aware that if Russia invaded, it had to fight a real war. And for 4 years or 5 years, what I've been seeing and what has been confirmed across multiple branches, maybe only the railway troops are not as they not have so many glaring issues, but the nature of their task makes it hard for them to have those. It seemed that everything that was visible through multiple sources or local sources came to light, and in a way, the emperor had no clothes.
Okay, so if I understand it correctly, a lot of analysts looked at the official statements and at the big maneuvers like Vostok 2018, where you basically had selected units that performed very well and that were well equipped and everything. But if you looked behind, you could see that there were major issues of corruption, fading money and other stuff. This brings us basically to the other question, what did you do differently to other analysts? If I understand it correctly, you looked at, I would say, smaller sources like local sources and bloggers and not at the more official statements. Is this correct?
Yes, and also when I could, I was going through. So for instance, when they stopped publishing so much data on terrorist activity and attacks on police, which is an issue for Russia, I would go to the forum for the Russian police, where if some policeman was killed in a certain region or if he was in the hospital because of a shooting, they would post a commemoration and people would say, this is our colleague, pray for him. And that way I could get more accurate data on where to look for something that might not come up on the national side. And for example, if I wanted to say to see how things were going within Ural-Vagon-Zavod, I would check the local news and I would see, for instance, several strikes by people from different foundries in the factory, and I would get more information that way on, let's say, how they were trying to actually cut working time without unemploying people, just firing people. They would just cut the shifts to 2 hours. Or if I wanted to see more information about Kurgan Machine Zavod, I would, again, look at news outlets for the local region. And I could see that, for instance, I think it was in 2018, they, due to bankruptcy procedures, couldn't get enough money to start up the production of engines for BMP-2s to deliver them on time to the army. And it was this sort of thing. And if you look at regional news, you see also issues with the operational budget of the Russian forces. You see that it's often the case that the Russian Ministry of Defense can't pay its electricity bills. In even major places like Khabarovsk, which is supposedly the area where you have the command of the Eastern Military District, you would see problems like around the northern part with the Northern Fleet, where they have to check and make sure they have enough money for the boilers and to have the hot water running. Otherwise, they just get their facilities destroyed. It's some of the more glaring things was that if you look very low down, you could see things like how certain brigade commanders are trying to make up for trained professionals. Like I've seen, I think in our initial talk, I showed you that they were looking for snipers, they were looking for BMP drivers in a local newspaper, but that was like the wanted ads in the newspaper of a town that has only 40,000 people around Kaliningrad.
So it would be like the US Army basically posting Craigslist, we need a sniper, we need a Bradley driver in this region.
Even worse than that, because that was the print edition. Craigslist has a reach, it's on the internet. This was in the print edition of a local paper. It would be like putting it in the paper that's in the public transport that's freely given out. And the other thing that you could look at was you could look at secondary sources for troop numbers. A few times there were leaks. So for one of the VDV events, they gave out commendations for everyone in the VDV. So I think in that case, the difference was instead of 60,000 as the nominal strength should be, it was closer to 48, 49,000. Now, this is something that most analysts flagged, but they expected the VDV to be slightly lower because it was being expanded a lot quicker. But we also saw it with just insurance leaks for all the uniformed service. So there we saw that the Russian uniformed staff would be closer to 700,000 and not the 1,014,000, which is the authorized strength by decree. You would also go to the ads for, let's say, the recent mobilization reserve, the bars. That is the quickly ready reserve. And you would see that they're paying something like, I have it on one of my tweets, but it's something like for a month for an officer to spend there up to, I don't know the exact figure, but it was from 10,000 to maybe 35,000 rubles, which for a monthly salary for someone who's a university graduate in Russia is very low. And for lower ranks, they were paying up to 15,000 and up to 5,000 for 2 or 3 days if they go there, which is not enough to cover your cost to reach the mustering point and from then go to the training. So there was not the, let me put it this way, at that point where they were issuing these prices, these salaries, for the time you spent during training. The ruble towards euro exchange rate was about 75, 80 rubles per euro. So we're talking about something like,
I put it in there.
Yeah, something like I'll give you the figures as well, but something like under 500 euros, which is at the top, the highest level with all the ranks and everything, which is unlikely to be what a lieutenant, who is the most common officer that's going to be called up for the training, was going to get. And then you had the military recruitment system, which was helpful because it was posting what people can make. And in its still current page on drivers for lorries, which need to have a category on their driver's license and everything, they need to pass a special exam. They were being offered something like 19,000 rubles. But don't worry, guys, with the added benefits and bonuses, you can get up to 25,000 rubles. And the delivery service, let's say in Moscow or in one of the bigger cities like Novosibirsk or Ekaterinburg or Petersburg, you would get twice as much to deliver food on your bicycle without being shot at in a vehicle.
Yeah.
The final point is I would go to forums for soldiers' relative. That is a forum called Mama Soldat, and there are similar other smaller ones. And you would go there and you would see what people were saying about their children who were actually being conscripted. And you would start getting just things that you need to send. And some of the things would include you have to pay this much when you get there to say hi to the professional soldiers, that is the ones on contract, so they don't bug you. This is how much you have to pay for actually getting a phone to be able to call from time to time. This is the fee so they don't steal your shoes again. And then you would start seeing that there was some hope that things would improve. In this case, I was following Boguchar, which is the main training camp near Voronezh, and things would improve up to 2016. So they'd say, oh, they're no longer going to sleep all in tents at the training ground. They're going to have a building built. And then they stopped building the building, and it started getting more and more depressing, even by people who were former officers and were thrilled that their children were going there. And if you look at local news or even Nova Gazeta on incidents around the area, it's a terrible place to send conscript to train them, because it's sometimes referred to, some of the units there, as an organized crime syndicate that just racketeers the soldiers who go there. And so they don't focus so much on training. It's more that the contract soldiers have turned it into a bonus pay system where every 6 months you get new people who are going to support you. When you combine that, you stop seeing an army that's prepared. You start seeing an army that's very cynical about its role, about how it's being paid, about what its prospects are. And this is even more noticeable within the motorized infantry units, not so much within the tankers. But this is what you need if you want to have an effective tank force.
So in a way, this also would undermine, I assume, the loyalty to the state and also to the country in that sense, because I mean, the Russian army is an organization of the state. I mean, I was a conscript in Austria, and I mean, we had some issues, but we literally first world problems. Yeah. I mean, if I imagine this, that they exploited, and if I understand it correctly, they had to bribe that they didn't get harassed or their shoes stolen. I mean, so basically, they lose money and then also get basically abused probably. So
yes,
this undermines everything. Is yeah.
And it only got worse when they started clamping down on reporting, because some of the reporting is for this part. It used to be called Dedovshtina when it was as part of the Soviet army, and sort of remained that as the phrasing they would use. But right now it's more of a way to get a steady income from the contract soldiers who are there. And those contract soldiers are not so focused on their professional qualification, they're focused on earning money. And in other cases, like one of the regiments, I think it was in the one of the in the tank division within the Western Military District, it was more prestigious. People got fed regularly. That was again a story from a conscript who served within 2 or 3 years ago, so something like 2018. But then he says, yeah, but none of our tanks work. So we didn't train with our vehicles because the entire vehicle park wasn't working. We had one machine that was working, but yeah, no one cared if you were in or out. It was like more of a vacation there. There were NCOs within my platoon that I've never seen, but they were on the roster. And you start getting, oh, it's not just that, it's also ghost soldiers, and it's also lying about the state of the equipment, even in the units that are considered elite. This was coupled with how figures for actual troop numbers were being reported. So one year you would say, we have added new contracts, 129,000, let's say, something according close to those figures. And then at the end of the year, you would see the contract numbers, the people who are professional soldiers, the lower ranks, only move by 20 to 30,000. So at that point, what the analyst community was thinking, okay, they're canceling their contracts every year. Let's say 1/3 of the people are canceling their contracts. Now that it got close to the war, we started getting reports on how people are actually doing this. So the unit commander would have a number that he would have to fill, and people would sign up for contracts, then cancel them within the grace period, and he would report, I have this many new contracts. But that doesn't mean he has contract soldiers. He just made a deal with contractees at the end for them to stay on. He'll fill his quota, and then they would leave. Again, that doesn't create the same number of, that doesn't create actual troops. That doesn't create enough people to man the newly created brigades and regiments out of previously just a single brigade that now has to be a division. And on top of that, you would think that this is happening just to backwards units. It's not done by decorated officers. There are people who are more serious about this. But one of the officers in the VDV who was arrested for doing a racketeering ring with layers and layers of payment schemes actually was a hero of the Russian Federation. He led the VDV at the parade on Victory Day. Another example that I gave you with the logistics officer, he was famous around Kaliningrad for restoring a tank and was a national hero. And on the side, he stole 2,600 tires for trucks. He stole a few tanks within spare parts and sold them, and even got convicted for that. So the way things were seen in terms of top-level announcements didn't usually report on what the military prosecution was seeing, what local news was seeing, and all the cases when they had to be silenced.
For me now, today I saw in the Austrian news, if I'm not mistaken, that Zelensky noted that about 20% of Ukraine is now occupied by Russian forces. For me, the question is now, how was this even possible? So were there certain units not that much affected? Or how did because if I follow your display, basically it's now, it would be, they shouldn't be able to cross the border, basically.
Not exactly, because certain units had higher readiness. But the other thing they had was just mass up to a certain point. And I was assuming at the start of the war that that the Ukrainian command would err on the side of caution a bit. And just in case, let's say, do a mobilization a bit earlier, do prepared positions a bit earlier. They knew the weaknesses of the Russian formation, so they wouldn't place their units in the south so far forward. I'm talking about around Crimea. They would focus on setting up 2 or 3 brigades as core military brigades within the cities, and then form around them auxiliary units with police and then territorials. But in places like Kherson, it doesn't seem to have happened. And that is part of the what allowed the Russian force to just steamroll up to almost Zaporozhye and then encircle Mariupol and make use of some of that mass. And on top of that, it wasn't just the Russian army that was being used as mass. It was also mass mobilization within the LNR and DNR, which allowed them to just have waves and waves of people to place in certain spots or just throw at the problem. And they also, wow, they were not as effective up north. They utilized what they could use from the Russian Guard and the interior troops and the Oman and even the special units. And that made them have, let's say, enough force to do that, while the focus of the Ukrainian government, I think initially was being spooked and trying not to make sure that Kiev doesn't fall. So even though Zelensky gets a lot of credit, he had to learn this war on the go, including his cabinet. So from what I saw, there was a lot of panic in the first few days if they could find enough troops to close all the gaps around Kiev. And at that point, the South wasn't that much of a priority. You wouldn't see, if your civilian government is that spooked, they wouldn't send things south. They would ignore things. And again, that's a sign that sometimes military-civilian relationships, being more on the side of the civilian side, don't actually lead to a good balance when it comes to military operations. But that's how I explain what I see in the initial stages of the war and why the mass in the south was more successful. Also, the Russian army, through sort of inertia, made the southern Russian military district the one with the highest readiness, because it sort of gravitated towards it. The war in Chechnya made it sure that you always had sort of a ready army down there in the south, or additionally with ready interior troops. Then the war in 2008 was almost entirely a 58 Army affair, and there's not enough information for it outside of that. And then for Syria, a lot of things had to be routed through bases there. And sort of with all of these piling up, not so much with a strategic vision, the southern military district became the one with the highest readiness. So maybe that could have additionally helped it, but that is more of an afterthought. I would say that the predominant thing was the Ukrainian posture at the beginning, and that they also got spooked and surprised because they couldn't believe what was happening. They didn't err on the side of caution, just in case if this crazy plan was being enacted. You could see it also with how they were late to decentralize their storage, how they were late to build additional trenches, how they were late to co-op a partial mobilization. And in this case, I would also say that a lot of the pessimistic reporting maybe influenced that, because if earlier Ukraine had gotten direct economic assistance, they could have done a preemptive mobilization and started having distributed storages of ammunition and military equipment, had just more bodies in the field, and just tried to do a defense of every sort of 10 to 15,000 town and up. And then because of the way the Russian columns were moving, you would very quickly pass the border, get them diluted, and then they could have been picked off earlier and not reached more vital cities. But it is what it is.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense, and I think it's a way more balanced view on the whole issue. So it's also interesting, yeah, that the military districts and basically their history that refers to the combat readiness and everything else. Of course, if somebody saw more action in later years, they're differently, and then you have veterans there, and they are more concerned than with somebody who basically didn't see action for decades. So it's very interesting. So from my side, that's everything. Is there anything you want to add?
I would really, it's more of an open suggestion to the professional analyst community that the guys who get paid to do this professionally and might have influenced the assessment. I don't think that the US intelligence assessment was that wrong. I think it's more that the intelligence assessment went and explained what the Russian plan was, what they were going to try to do, probably gave the internal briefings what the state of the Ukrainian forces is and what the chances of success are if certain things happen. And then when we got it through the political lens, you got it with the bias of politicians who have a certain idea of the Russian army, whereas people who are doing the raw intercept and know how many flight hours Russian pilots have, or how much even brigade commanders have stolen from their, let's say, petty cash jar, because Russian brigade commanders have some discretionary spendings, would have seen it differently. But my idea is that a lot of the analysts within Europe probably should have looked on how the top level data can be reconciled with a lot of Russian local news, because it wasn't hidden within the Russian local news, because it was causing almost constantly a low level of outrage, even within the Russian defense analyst community and people who are now focusing on other things, because just reporting on current events within the Russian military for the last few years is dangerous, outright dangerous for them. And they could have tempered those analyses with the reality and tried to find a more balanced take, because initially a lot more could have been done to help Ukraine set up, let's say, an earlier mobilization, set up systems more higher amount of imported systems and acquire them and get a lot more people proficient. They could have had more fortified areas. They could have had more caches of weapons, not for some resistance, but they actually had enough people they could have brought up to hold lines and blunt the attack there. But it was seen as a fait accompli, which wasn't the case if you see the Donbass fighting, which wasn't the case if you see the motivation of the Ukrainian troops. They stayed fighting even in 2014, where they were being counterattacked by more professional Russian troops compared to now. They weren't going to budge, they were going to fight till the end. And they were getting tactical victories all the way through the last 8 years of the conflict. And in the background, they were preparing for another conflict in case that came. But the initial response we had in Europe was very demoralizing. And the late deliveries of weaponry, and that until 2 or 3 weeks after the start of the war, we had politicians still considering that Ukraine doesn't have a chance, when the Russian army isn't just built to mobilize enough troops without going into some very difficult conversations domestically about where is actually this army that you told us about. It was very unlikely that the Russian army, even if very successful, and I think initially in some cases it was incredibly successful, and I would say lucky, but luck is a combination of other factors. It didn't have a chance to gain anything strategic, and more that it was going to basically mow itself into irrelevance, trying to get those broad war goals.
So thank you very much, Stan.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, then everyone, thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.